Each time you tell someone to do or believe something, or when you're explaining why you do or believe something, you are giving an argument. The problem is, the vast majority of people aren't really good at arguments. We tend to confuse making a good argument with having witty comebacks or just making your points more loudly and angrily, instead of building a case on a solid foundation of logic, which can be harder than it sounds. Around 2,400 years ago, when Plato was laying out how reason can and should function in the human mind, he believed that we all have what he called a tripartite soul, what you might think of as yourself or your psyche divided into three parts. First, there's the rational or logical part of the soul, which represents cool reason. This is the aspect of yourself that seeks the truth and is swayed by facts and arguments. When you decide to stop eating bacon for 2 meals a day because, as delicious as it is, it's bad for you, then you make that decision with the guidance of the rational part of your soul. But then there's the spirited aspect, often described as the emotional part of the self, although that doesn't really quite capture it. The spirited soul isn't just about feeling, it's also about how your feelings fuel your actions. It's the part that responds in righteous anger at injustice, the part that drives your ambition and calls upon you to protect others. It gives you a sense of honor and duty and is swayed by sympathy. So if you decide to stop eating bacon because you just finished reading Charlotte's Web and now you're in love with Wilbur, then you're being guided by the spirited part of your soul. But we share the next part of our soul with other animals, be they pig or moose or aardvark. The appetitive part is what drives you to eat, have sex, and protect yourself from danger. It is swayed by temptations that are carnal and visceral. So at those times when you go ahead and just eat all the bacon because it just smells so dang good, the appetitive aspect of your soul is in control. Now, Plato believed that the best human beings are always ruled by the rational part of their soul because it works to keep the spirited and the appetitive parts in check. People who allow themselves to be ruled by their spirited or appetitive selves are base, he believed, and not fully, properly human. Now, most of us don't buy into the concept of the tripartite soul anymore, or the idea that some humans are less human than others, but we do understand that we're all motivated by physical desires, emotional impulses, and rational arguments. And philosophers continue to agree with Plato that reason should be in the driver's seat. So how do we make sure that we're ruled by good, sound, not flawed reason? By perfecting the art of the argument. An argument in philosophy isn't just a shouting match. Instead, philosophers maintain that your beliefs should always be backed up by reasons, which we call premises. Premises form the structure of your argument. They offer evidence for your belief, and you can have as many premises as you like as long as they support your conclusion, which is the thing that you actually believe. So let's dissect the anatomy of an argument. There are actually several different species of arguments. Probably the most familiar and the easiest to carry out is the deductive argument. The main rule of a deductive argument is, if your premises are true, then your conclusion must be true. And knowing that something is actually true is very rare and awesome. So here's a boiled down version of a good deductive argument. Premise 1, all humans are mortal. Premise 2, Socrates is human. Conclusion, Socrates is mortal. This kind of reasoning, where one fact leads to another, is called entailment. Once we know that all humans are mortal and that Socrates is human, those facts entail that Socrates is mortal. Deduction begins with the general, in this case what we know about human mortality, and reasons down to the specific, Socrates in particular. What's great about deductive arguments is that the truth of the premises must lead to the truth of the conclusion. When this happens, we say that the argument is valid. There's no way for the conclusion to be false if the premises are true. Now check out this argument. All humans are mortal, Socrates is a human, therefore Socrates was Plato's teacher. That argument is invalid because nothing about human mortality can prove that Socrates was Plato's teacher. It leads us to another issue, and that is, validity is not the same as truth. All valid really means is that if the premises are true, then your conclusion can't be false. But that doesn't mean that your premises prove your conclusion to be correct. Like in the case of whether Socrates was Plato's teacher, the premises are true and the conclusion is true, but the argument is still not valid because the premises don't in any way prove the conclusion. It just happens to be true. If your premises don't guarantee the truth of your conclusion, then you can end up with some really crappy arguments, like this one. All cats are mammals. I'm a mammal, therefore I'm a cat. As much as part of me would like to be my cat, this is invalid because the conclusion doesn't entail from the premises. And it probably goes without saying, but you can have a perfectly valid argument and still have a false conclusion if any of your premises are false. For example, all humans have tails, my brother John is a human, therefore John Green has a tail. The argument is totally valid because the premises entail the conclusion. The reasoning totally stands up. It's just that one of the premises is flawed. The reason that deduction is prized by philosophers and lots of other important kinds of thinkers is that it's the only kind of argument that can give you a real certainty. But it's limited, because it only works if if you're starting with known true premises, which are hard to come by. Inductive reasoning relies on the predictability of nature to reveal that the future is likely to resemble the past, often in important ways. But it's important to remember that unlike deduction, where true premises entail true conclusions, inductive premises only mean that the conclusion is likely to be true. Inductive arguments don't provide you with certainty. Instead, they work in terms of probabilities. And they're useful for more than just predicting what's going to happen. For example, most men in ancient Athens had beards. Socrates was a man who lived in ancient Athens. Therefore, Socrates probably had a beard. This is an inductive argument because it starts with what we already know about the grooming habits of ancient Athenian men and about the time and place in which Socrates lived, and makes an educated guess based on that information. There's no guarantee that the conclusion is correct, but what's known would seem to support it. Reasoning like this is incredibly useful, which is why it's so common, but there's also a problem. The future doesn't always resemble the past, and every pattern has its outliers. So induction always has the potential to produce false results. There are times when you need to get at the truth in other ways, like by eliminating what's obviously not true and considering what's most likely. Or, Mr. Holmes says, and I quote, "When you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth." This is probably the best, most succinct description ever given of the kind of reasoning known as abduction. Which I know sounds like we're talking about kidnapping or something, but abduction is a thought process sometimes described as inference to the best explanation. Abduction doesn't reason straight from a premise to a conclusion, as we've seen in deduction and induction. Instead, it reasons by ruling out possible explanations until you're left with the most plausible one given the evidence. Beware, because abduction must be used carefully. It uses only information you have at hand. That's why doctors and detectives work so hard to dig up more data and recreate events from the past so they can help draw better conclusions. Now that we've looked at some argument types, let's find out how philosophers use arguments to interact with each other. Because philosophers don't argue like other people do. Philosophers hold each other to different, higher standards. They don't teach each other to get away with saying, "I reject your argument because I don't like its conclusion," or "That's preposterous, peanut M&Ms are so good." Instead, if you disagree with a conclusion, you need to give reasons, just like the first person did when they made their case. Both people involved in this kind of exchange are known as interlocutors, because we have to name everything. The first one advances an argument, and the second one can either accept it or offer a counter-argument, which is just what it sounds like, an argument offered in opposition to another argument. I, however, think you're wrong, so I give you a counter-argument. So you counter my counter-argument with a counter-counter-argument. Arguments are meant to be useful, so we don't have to use the same kind of reasoning when we argue. This way of exchanging ideas through dialogue was popularized by Socrates, and so has become known as the Socratic method. Socrates thought dialogue was the best way to learn and to get at truth. And it's important to note that while philosophers have a reputation for being an argumentative lot, they don't think of the Socratic method as something that results in a winner and a loser. Rather, it's an exercise that brings both interlocutors closer to the truth. The goal of the philosopher is not to win, but to find truth, so you shouldn't be disappointed if someone presents a counter-argument that you can't find a response to. When that happens, a good philosopher will be grateful to their interlocutor for helping them reject false beliefs and build stronger ones.